Thank you so much, Commissioner, and thank you for those kind words. And again, thank you all for being here. It's almost as full as it was when Congressman DeFazio was still in the room. And he gave a good insight on our, of course, infrastructure, especially on the coast. We do have a great panel here. Look forward to the conversation, so I'm not going to belabor that, other than to just talk about some of the pieces of legislation that are going to come up for discussion today, and that is Senate Bill 262, which of course is the tax exemption for multiple unit housing. Senate Bill 608, which is the rent stabilization bills. House Bill 2001, the middle housing in lands zoned for single family dwelling. House Bill 2003, the regional housing needs study. House Bill 2916, the transitional housing, and House Bill 4079, which was 2016 legislative session, affordable housing pilot program. And so with that, we'll move forward with some questions that we have. And that is, how do the bills that passed this session on housing issues work together across Oregon's regions to address the housing crisis? And Margaret, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Great, thank you so much, Representative. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margaret Salazar, and I'm Director of Oregon Housing and Community Services. We are your state housing agency, so I'm thrilled to be here today for this discussion. And I just want to set a little bit of additional context. The 2019 legislative session was truly a historic moment for the issue of housing in our state. It was a landmark session, and I think as you'll hear throughout the panel, there were a number of strategies that came through the session thanks to the legislature's leadership. I wanted to also make sure that you're aware that in addition to the bills that we'll be talking about, we also came through the legislative session with a historic housing funding package, and of course our agency will be implementing that package. Governor Brown came forward with a bold housing agenda last fall, really putting out there a significant plan to address the need for affordable housing funding and the funding for homeless services and other critical services to address our issues. The legislature then answered the call. So we came out of the legislative session with a $330 million funding package that dwarfs anything that we've seen previously. 2017 we saw as a landmark year, and that was about a $135 million package. So we really are seeing a new moment. And I know that you all discussed infrastructure this morning, and I'd like to make a plug that housing is part of that infrastructure for the state of Oregon, is a lasting investment in our infrastructure. So we are very excited about that opportunity. And the funding package includes sticks and bricks dollars for affordable housing development. It includes permanent supportive housing funding. It includes funding for homeless assistance and a number of other strategies. So there's really an array of strategies there. So when we look at the landscape coming out of 2019, a couple of things that we wanted to highlight. There are definitely strategies to look at the immediate response to the housing crisis. So whether that's homeless services funding, and we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like, to make sure that we are keeping those critical homeless service dollars flowing in our communities and trying some new approaches, as well as Senate Bill 608, which was really a response to the very visceral and very real crisis of affordability that our vulnerable and low-income renters are facing in terms of rent increases and rent stabilization, to that sort of intermediate term response, the 2 to 5 year response, which is really the affordable housing construction funds and some of those other strategies, as well as really starting to move into the space of looking at our long-term underlying need for housing supply. And I think you'll be hearing more about that when we start talking about things like House Bill 2001, House Bill 2003. So it's really a multi-strategy approach to get at the immediate need, the intermediate response, and the long-term supply issues. This panel knows very well that we underbuilt in Oregon about 150,000 units over the last 15 years, so we have a lot of work to do to address the supply crisis, but I'm happy that we're able to look at the immediate, the short-term, and the long-term approaches. And I just want to note as we get into the discussion today that we are doing a ton of work, particularly here on the coast. One of the funding sources that we got out of the session is the LIFT program, the Local Innovation and Fast Track Housing Program. We received $150 million in LIFT funds coming out of the session. That's basically a doubling of that program. And we are already doing a great deal of construction on the coast with the LIFT program resources, including right here in Florence, where we have a 12-unit development under development now. We have projects that have opened their doors in Yachats, projects that are under construction in Newport, and as well as Tillamook and Astoria. So we have a lot to celebrate, but obviously a lot more work to do going forward.
Thank you. My name is John Van Nightingham. I'm a legal aid lawyer working with the Oregon Law Center based in Eugene. And for 30 years, I have spent most of my time advocating for either tenant rights or affordable housing at the local level, Wayne County, Eugene, Springfield, and in the state legislature. And I want to praise the 2019 legislature for doing something that only a few other states have done. And when we're talking about over the spectrum, Margaret just described a lot of one of those focuses, but I think a lot of advocates are realizing now that the solution to the housing crisis, and we'll talk more about whether there is a solution to the housing crisis, but if you're going to do this, you need to take at least a three-pronged approach. One is tenant protections, and Jim Straub's going to talk about Senate Bill 608. There were a couple of other bills in this legislature that had to do with tenant protections. The second is funding for affordable housing. That's a lot of what Margaret was talking about here. But the third is trying to free up the private sector to provide more housing. We're not going to build enough affordable housing units, no matter how much money the legislature gives Margaret's apartment to house everybody. We're going to have to use the private sector to build housing.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, I know I appreciate those comments, especially with regards to Senate Bill 608. We have differing opinions when it comes to those situations, and we'll have the data as the years unfold, as other communities across the nation are actually rolling those back. So we'll move on to the second question. What more can be done to prevent the unhoused population from growing? And what have the current policies accomplished, and what are the trends in the state? And John, we'll start with you.
So I was designated with this question, but I want to defer to the two experts up here, because I'm not an expert on homelessness or trends, and Professor Zapata is the first one. Sure. No. Professor Zapata, I think, just finished a study of the trends of homelessness in the metro area, or maybe just Multnomah County, but I hope she'll talk about that. And then Margaret, this is what Margaret's department does, is try to provide funding for homelessness around the state. I want to add some stuff, but I want to recognize those two are the ones that should be talking about.
Thank you very much. I am, in addition to being an associate professor of land use planning, the director of the Portland State Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative. We're a university-wide research center located at Portland State. I think one of the important things to note to start with is that we define homelessness as including people who are unsheltered, living in emergency and shelter transitional housing, as well as what's covered under the Department of Education called the doubled up population. And so that's people who because they have no other choice, are living with friends, families, sometimes even strangers on couches, in attics and sheds. It's part of the reason why when you see Department of Education numbers on homelessness, they look so much higher than the annual or the every 2-year count required by HUD called the point in time count. How many of you have heard of the point in time count? How many of you heard of the Department of Education homelessness numbers? Yeah. Media loves point in time count. It's a terrible number to understand trends. It is a one-night snapshot of whoever could be found. And yet, so much of our policy decision-making and media coverage focuses on that number. So at Portland State, we decided to take a different approach. We looked at the Tri-County area. We added up the point-in-time count numbers and used what is called an annualizing rate to estimate how many people experienced homelessness over the year. We then included the people who were doubled up and the people who were in emergency shelter over the year. And instead of a sum, if you aggregated the point-in-time count numbers for the 3 counties, being about 6,000, we estimate that in 2017, 38,000 people experienced homelessness in the Tri-County area. We further estimated that 107,000 households were facing severe housing burden. We're facing severe housing insecurity or at risk for homelessness. Now, a lot of those households are getting support, but we have no way of knowing whether that support is adequate, and we have no way of knowing if those support levels will actually continue because so much of our funding is dependent on the federal government. So when it comes to trends, I don't think the answer is particularly positive. One of the things I really think that we're trying to say at the center is the analogy that right now we're really focusing on saving all the drowning children in the river, and we're not being able to actually go upstream and find out who's throwing them in the river. And it's these upstream solutions that in part Margaret and I will talk about that become so vital in actually stopping our unhoused communities from growing further. I do think there's been tremendous effort from the legislature, particularly in just cause eviction and in capping the amount that rent can go up for residents. We should see some relief there. But how many of you are living in housing markets that are exceeding income levels? Right, so those of us who are living in areas like on the coast where our housing rates are going up astronomically and our incomes are staying flat, until we actually tackle those issues, we're not going to really see any change in what's happening.
And I'd like to piggyback on that, and I really appreciate those insights and talk a little bit about a couple of the approaches that are seeing some success that we think are really promising in terms of the fight to end homelessness. So one of them is a strategy that we have really made a centerpiece of our statewide housing plan, our 5-year plan, which is permanent supportive housing. How many of you have heard the term permanent supportive housing or familiar with that? Yeah, so it's a model that is really emerging nationally as a best practice to help stabilize folks that are experiencing particularly chronic homelessness. It's essentially affordable housing with services and rental assistance attached so that folks have an ability to access services and become stable. So particularly for individuals that are experiencing chronic homelessness or have mental health diagnosis or ex-offenders, can be a very, very effective tool, not only to stabilize folks and get them off the street and rehoused and moving into that kind of an opportunity, but also to save funds downstream to other public systems. So for permanent supportive housing, there's a direct link toward saving funds for emergency rooms, hospital visits, criminal justice expenditures, and even educational expenditures. And that's a model that the legislature funded coming out of 2019 at a record $50 million level. And additionally, a new partnership between my department and the Oregon Health Authority to work together on making those supportive services available to residents of permanent supportive housing. So we are going big on this strategy, and we've made a commitment to create 1,000 new permanent supportive housing units over the next 5 years across the state of Oregon, not just in big cities, but also in rural areas. So this is something that we're leaning into. The other bright spot I wanted to shine on, and this is something that I've worked with closely with Director Smith in his prior role at the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs, is the effort around veteran homelessness. We just wrapped up a campaign called Operation Welcome Home, which we worked on directly with ODVA. We made a commitment with 10 communities across the state, many of your communities, to house 500 veterans between Veterans Day and Memorial Day of 2018 to 2019. We sailed through that goal. More than 500 veterans were housed. And in addition to that, we made some lasting infrastructure investments in those communities so that they have things like a by name list of the veterans in their communities that are experiencing homelessness. They're moving toward coordinated entry and working together at the local level. So there are some success stories about really dedicated campaigns to lean into housing specific populations.
Let me add a couple of points. From my reading, I think the trend in homelessness is up. Greater numbers, and it's national. It's not just the West Coast or big cities. There's a publication in Portland called Street Roots that addresses homelessness issues. They sent a reporter to do stories all across the state, especially in rural areas, and they did a series of stories on the coast. You can find it online. They went to have stories in Newport, Florence, Coos Bay, and those stories talk about how homelessness is impacting those communities. And it's it's not much different really than Portland. But also, if you look at the populations within the homeless population, I think what you're seeing are increases in the number of first-time homeless. So you probably have a vision of who you think is homeless. It's not that. These are people that are working full-time and can't afford a place to live. So think about that. They're working full-time and can't afford a place to live. The Huffington Post publication recently looked at Salt Lake City, which a couple of years ago bragged that they had solved homelessness. Well, not exactly. They had addressed those homeless who have drug and alcohol concerns under the theory that if you house them, they're much better able to kick the addiction than if they're living on the streets. But their homeless number just went through the roof for the same reasons that I just described. And it's worth reading that article in the May Huffington Post. But one of the quotes in that, homelessness is a product of prosperity. Think about that. Homelessness is a product of prosperity. So where our communities are doing real well economically, housing costs are going up. More people want to live there. Demand drives costs, rents. And so people who are low income or working poor no longer can pay the rents. So, they're homeless. There are a lot of things I think cities and counties can do, and I hope we'll have it. There's not a specific question on our list, but I hope we'll come back to that and talk about this.
Anyone else? The rest of the panel is supposed to join in on these conversations and discussions. Okay. Well, Mr. Straub, the next one's for you, and then it says, then the rest of the panel, just to remind all of you. But you were very involved in the negotiations and work behind Senate Bill 608, Mr. Straub, and in your position professionally. So can you please help describe to us the legislation in the terms of the rent and tenant protections, but how you were able to thread the needle, if you will, with your associate members and keeping the small landlords and businesses and providing for those renter protections?
Well, I think I'll answer it in two parts.
Please.
Let me, the bill, Senate Bill 608, is complicated and lengthy. And I think a lot of people, including attorneys, still haven't figured out quite exactly what it does or what it's intended to do yet. So I'm going to briefly, I wrote down some high points and I'll go through those to get those out. Maybe we can talk about that, make sure there's collaboration in what I said and what I think it will do. And then I'll tell you how we arrive at Senate Bill 608. There's an interesting backstory to it, and I'm not sure if it's unique or not, but I think it's worthy in its own right. So, generally speaking, first, my name is Jim Straub. I'm the Legislative Director for the Oregon Housing Association, which is the largest landlord association in the state of Oregon. We have 14 chapters throughout the state. We're active in promoting fair and just legislation, obviously, with a slant towards landlords. But tenants are customers, are consumers, and we try to be fair and balanced. I've been doing that for the last 10 years, but really I'm a landlord. Lifelong landlord. I've been doing this, I believe I'm in my 30th year. Doesn't seem like that long, but that's a long time. And I'm third generation here in Lane County as a landlord. I learned from my father and from my grandfather. My grandfather started being a landlord back in 1952. So we've been around for a while. We were builders, we were developers, and we were landlords. So I've been in the industry for a while. My grandfather, after he had a career in professionally, he went into politics and started out in Lane County as a county commissioner, and then he was elected as senator, served as senator for a while. He served for a couple of terms as state treasurer, 8 years as state treasurer, and then he was served a term as governor. So he was around for a little bit. He was in the 70s, the Tom McCall era. They passed some pretty interesting land use regulations, and I was around then. I heard him talk intimately So my father and my grandfather were business partners, but they were also best friends. So when my grandfather went into politics, my dad took over the building, the construction business and the rental business. But they saw each other constantly. We were at his house or he was at our house on a weekly basis. So I was absorbing all the background of the whys, of the legislation and the intent. And then as I was trying to escape the industry, go to college, got a couple of degrees, wasn't able to successfully get away from it. But I worked with my grandfather on a daily basis in his later years, managing his affairs. And he walked me through the whys of the legislative aspects of what he accomplished, what he felt they were intended to do originally, and how they were succeeding in that. So, I've got a little bit of that steeped in me. I don't have his statesmanship credentials, but I do try to maintain a civil discourse and try to work for positive solutions. So, Senate Bill 608, generally speaking, it limits rent increases within any 12-month period to no more than 7% above the Western region's change in the Consumer Price Index. There's an exception for if the property is less than 15 years old. It also prohibits termination of month-to-month tenancies without cause after 1 year of occupancy. It also requires fixed-term tenancies to convert to month-to-month after a year of occupancy unless a new fixed term is agreed upon in advance by both parties, landlord and tenant. Or if the landlord has warned the tenant contemporaneously in writing of 3 separate violations of the rental agreement within the preceding 12 months and has provided 90 days of written notice. That's to weed out the bad actor tenants. If they're not complying with landlord-tenant law in a way that you can give legal notice for, then they're kind of giving up their right to continue the tenancy, or not giving up the right, but there's kind of an automatic rollover clause that kind of guarantees them that the contract is going to continue without threat of being evicted. There's an exception when the owner occupies the home or lives in an accessory dwelling unit on the premises. Senate Bill 608 also allows landlords to terminate tenancies with 90 days notice in order to demolish or repurpose the dwellings, to renovate or repair homes that are or will be unsafe for occupancy, or for when the landlord intends to occupy the premises as a primary residence for themselves or their immediate family. There is also an exception for selling the home. When the landlord has notified the tenant within 120 days of accepting a buyer's offer to purchase the dwelling, and the new owner intends to occupy the home as their primary residence. Senate Bill 608 also requires landlords to pay tenants 1 month's rent in advance to help defray the cost of moving unless the landlord owns 4 or fewer dwelling units. If the landlord violates any of these, they're penalized by the actual cost that the tenant incurs by the violation plus 3 months' rent. So that's a substantial penalty. So that's what the bill does. Let's talk about that. John, you want to jump in? I know you probably know it better than most anybody else. Make sure that you agree with my summary. I mean, it's a 28-page bill, so this is just a brief overview. Sure, you go ahead and what it doesn't do.
So I want to note that Oregon has a long history of landlords and tenants negotiating changes to landlord-tenant law. Since the early 1980s, that's been the case. Through something called the Coalition, which I used to lead. That coalition got killed by a particular landlord group in Portland, not Jim's group. It's no longer in existence, and we'll see how that works out going forward. But this bill actually was another example of a landlord advocate, Jim Straub, and a tenant advocate, in this case a very powerful one, the Speaker of the House, negotiating the terms of the bill. So it was a compromise bill. And what it reflects is that I think Jim Straub is a landlord who recognizes that we ought to find a way to work together. I mean, Oregon, that's sort of the Oregon mantra. Let's find a way to work together. And he's great at that. This bill is a compromise. It's a rent cap. It's not rent control. There's no bureaucracy that will determine how much a landlord can raise the rent or not. not. It's a hard cap. It's 7% plus CPI statewide. No process. That's a lot. I think Professor Zamata will probably talk about, hopefully, that there are a lot of tenants and tenant advocates that think that's too high. Jim determined with his members that they don't raise rent that much. So this doesn't harm them, and it's aimed at rent gouging, not rent control. It's aimed at rent gouging, because some of that was happening in Portland. The other thing it does is it doesn't kick in for the first 15 years, so it doesn't discourage new development. Because one of the criticisms of rent control is it discourages new development, and unless you build new units, you have the same problem with supply. How would I do?
That's fantastic, John. You can talk a little more about how wonderful I am. So anybody else want to weigh in on, would you like to jump in? I don't want to exclude anybody before we get to, I'm sorry. Okay.
All right, my nails were too long to get the button to work. So I do want to say that the bill wasn't just responding to what was happening in Portland, but we know that a lot of the towns on the coasts and then in the tourist areas were also experiencing a lot of price gouging. We all love to blame the Californians, right? So the evil Californians are coming in, and anybody from California? No one's going to admit it now. Oh, there's like 2 brave people up front. It's like the one group we're all allowed to publicly be like, the Californians have come and they're driving up our rates. Yes, there are a lot of advocates who do think that the cap is too high. I think that one of the things I have the luxury of being able to do is take a little bit more of a wait and see approach. Part of what I have tried to convey to people is that we know what our policies have done for the past 20, 30, 40 years. We actually don't know for sure what they will do. And so if we put something into place and we find actually it's still too high, or it's too low, or it's doing whatever, then we have to revisit things. And I think that's one of the challenges for statewide policy, is seeing how things will in fact play out from place to place. There's always a lot of doomsday predictions when things happen. I think the other thing that I've seen a lot in terms of the rent cap is that it's not going to do anything. It's not going to help anything. And I think the one thing to really keep in mind with that is housing submarkets. And so we tend to talk about the housing market as a monolith, and in reality there are very different things happening within submarkets, particularly those at the lower income level. And so maybe in overall median rent value or rent prices, or across the entire median of population, it doesn't do very much, but it actually makes a huge difference for people who are making 0 to 60% of median family income. We talked about just cause eviction too? All right, so one of the things I'm really excited about with this bill is, as I was saying earlier, I think this actually has some of the most opportunity to influence homelessness. It also does something that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that we now will have a data source to understand exactly how many people in our state are being affected by eviction, because it requires that eviction will now be registered with the courts. How many of you have heard of Matthew Desmond's eviction study? Ooh, wow, this is awesome. All right, so forget I mentioned him, and don't Google him. He's done a lot of work around evictions around the country, and people will always say, well, why don't we just replicate his studies? Well, because we haven't been able to. Because no one has been required to give people a cause for eviction. They haven't had to put anything into a database. So what I can actually tell you about the state of evictions in Oregon is fairly limited. And so the opportunity to really understand and be able to see how policies play out across the state, I think has been really enhanced by that. That's your nerd research component for the day.
So let me add a point about that. So that's what I do for a living mostly, or I used to do for a living, but you represent people who are being evicted. An eviction means that you've got a termination notice from your landlord and you're required to move. There is no record of that. So that's a transaction. It's a landlord giving a notice to a tenant. Nobody knows about that but those two people. If the tenant doesn't leave voluntarily, the landlord then files an eviction lawsuit called a forcible entry into tenant, FED. There are records of that as with any court suit. That's the only thing. But it's county by county. There's no statewide collection of that. We've tried over the years to try to look at FEDs around the state. It's very time intensive, but there's no master list of evictions, and I don't see a way really to track it.
I have the list. We actually did get the list from, I forget the office that has the database. So we have the list of all FED cases, but getting any information from that list is actually really hard. We've been working with your organization on this because in an archaic type of data collection, you have to click on about 10 different links that all have different underlying file structures. And so we're actually trying to pull that information. But I do have the actual list, and so maybe one of these awesome directors want to help me get the actual underlying database. Margaret's like, I'm going to kill you.
So, let me tell you how we came to have Sentinel 608. So let me start with, I told you some of my backstory and who I am, what I am. I am a landlord. I'm a small business owner. I'm also a Democrat, but I'm a small business owner. I like to make money. That's why we're in the industry. That's why we're in the business, theoretically. We should do it ethically. We should do it fairly. But the ultimate goal is actually to make a living. John alluded to the Landlord-Tenant Coalition that's been in existence since the 80s. I've had the privilege of participating in that Landlord-Tenant Coalition for the last decade. It's fantastic. It's a perfect example of bipartisan negotiation and support. We created an omnibus bill each session that we had pre-negotiated, and we would go, the landlords and the tenants would go through the legislature and both promote and advocate for it. And it was a win for the legislators because both sides were saying, this is a good bill, we both agree, we don't want to oppose it. Made it real easy to vote for it. And that worked fantastically. Until the times changed a little bit. The housing crisis started. Nobody's saying, even landlords are not saying there isn't a housing crisis. But once it started, then things kind of took more of an urgent nature. And it doesn't take much to trigger a fight or flight model for business owners. There was a landlord group based in Portland, spearheaded by some attorneys and other large landlords that were starting to participate in the Landlord-Tenant Coalition. The coalition by nature was all inclusive. Anybody could participate, anybody could communicate through it. So they started participating. And then John Van Lanningham and some of the tenant advocates came and said, hey, look, we've got this problem. We need to start dealing with just cause evictions. We need to start dealing with rent gouging. And there was that fight or flight trigger. And the landlord said, whoa, slow down. That's a lot to ask for. We can't go there yet. So that is a very brief synopsis of what happened. There was kind of the tenant advocate saying, we have to talk about this, and the landlords at the time saying, we can't talk about that, that sounds like an industry killer. And so that stopped the coalition from moving forward, which is very unfortunate, I think, for both sides. And so that set the stage for the tenant advocates and Speaker Kotek and others to push forward 2018's House Bill 2004, which promoted a lot of tenant protections. I was instrumental in defeating that, for better or for worse. It was not something that we had participated in the negotiations of. We didn't agree with impacts and the broad reach of it. I and my members worked diligently, and we stopped it. Not by much, but we stopped it. But we did it with fairness. I mean, we didn't try any trickery, and we were above board, I felt, hopefully Speaker Kotek felt the same way. We defeated it. Speaker Kotek and others worked diligently to overcome the obstacles that they saw were in the way. And to jump ahead a little bit, after the 2018 session, we had the election in November. Our landlord backstop was Senator Rod Monroe. He was a landlord, he was a Democrat, he was an incumbent, fairly well respected, and he toed the line to stop things for us, you know, and that was helpful. But he got voted out of office, not by a slim margin, by another Democrat by over 40%. So it's a pretty resounding message that was sent. At the same time, the same election, statewide, Democrats gained a supermajority. Landlords, gosh, we thought all was lost. We knew the previous term, the previous session, they had asked for House Bill 2004, and we thought that was bad. Now they've got a supermajority. They're not going to come back with just 2004. Why not take a bigger bite? So we were worried, understandably. And to my surprise, here's the backstory, the stuff that, and I actually reached out to before I get into it, Speaker Kotek. I texted her this morning and I said, you know, I'm speaking on this panel, how free am I to speak about, you know, conversations and stuff? She said, go for it, Jim. Talk about it, no reservations. So I feel a little better about having that. So on Thursday, so the election was Tuesday. On Thursday, I remember it vividly. I was driving home from work. I pulled up into my driveway, my phone rang. Stepped out of my car, I answered it. I said, hey Jim, this is Tina. I said, hi Tina. I was, you know, wondering who it was. She goes, no, it's Jim, Tina Kotek, Speaker of the House. I said, oh, hi. And she goes, well, I'm not sure if you realize, but you know, I got a supermajority on Tuesday. I said, well, gosh, yeah, I noticed that. I hope you're not just calling it glow. And she goes, no. I'm sure as you are aware, I'm going to try to pass a housing bill. And I said, yeah, we figured as such. She goes, well, I was hoping that you'd have some time to chat with me about it. I said, sure, you know, I'd be happy to. She goes, great. Do you have time this coming Tuesday? I said, yeah, of course. She goes, great. I'll drive down to your office. She's in Portland, I'm in Springfield. So, great. She said, what time do you open? I said, anytime you're there, I'll be there. She goes, great, I'll be there at 8 o'clock in the morning. So, jump ahead to Tuesday. This is 1 week after the election, 1 week after she got the supermajority. She shows up at my humble office in Springfield, Oregon, and we sit down across my desk, and we spent 4.5 hours talking. And to her credit, and this isn't a love fest for Tina, I don't agree with everything she does, all of her policies, but she is a remarkably smart individual. She's a good listener, and she's an excellent conversationalist. And so she started out saying, Jim, here are the problems that I see and that my members have told me are solvable in the short term in the housing industry. And this is what I want to do to fix it. And it was scary. As a landlord, it was horribly scary. It was an industry killer, really. I mean, they're coming out of the gate saying no rent increases. Once somebody moves in, you don't get a raise the rent, period, forever. Perpetual leases. People don't get to get out of it. You know, until they voluntarily leave, no rent increases, no ability to ask them to leave. That scares landlords. We don't like that. But we talked and talked and talked. I gave her real world examples of why in certain situations we need just cause evictions, or more aptly or correctly termed just cause notices to ask people to leave. There's lots of reasons why. Just because it's not identified on a legal form as to why we're asking somebody to leave doesn't mean that it's not justified. It just means that there isn't a legal, provable point that we want to make to ask them to leave. So we talked through all the issues that we had. We talked through why we raised rents in the industry, what that accomplishes, and why. You know, house is usually the single largest investment in somebody's life. And if you have an investment in another house that you're going to rent out, that's ginormous. You're putting all your eggs, or most of your eggs, into a single basket. $200,000, $300,000 that you're turning over to somebody that you've never really met before. That's a huge risk. That's scary. And nowadays, in order to abide by federal fair housing laws and stuff, basically we're looking at them on paper with a few little background checks that we can do. But I take it, there's a lot of small business owners in this group. It's similar to hiring somebody. It's scarier than hiring somebody because of the cost implications, but you're hiring somebody without an interview, with only an application, and you don't have the ability to fire them, really. And there's great cost associated with it. So that's worrisome. We just have to take them at face value for the most part and put them in a home that costs $200,000, $300,000 and hope and pray that when they hand it back to us, it's worth the same or close to it. So I conveyed all of those worries and real life examples of why we need some of the things that we have in place. And she listened well, she took great notes, she came back to me, we had lots of conversations, this wasn't a single conversation. We talked, almost on a daily basis, weekly basis. We went through everything, and she came back and said, well, what about this? What about this scenario? What if we changed this? What if we added this? We talked through hundreds and hundreds of different scenarios that we could do. Senate Bill 608, from a landlord's perspective, we don't like it. I don't like it. I wish Senate Bill 608 didn't happen, to be honest. I know there's a housing crisis and stuff, but, we didn't cause the housing crisis, landlords didn't. This is a symptom of the overall illness. So we were worried about what was going to happen. But we also knew that if we didn't do anything, the inevitable was going to happen without our input. So yes, this is a negotiated bill. And I'm proud of the work that Speaker Kotek and I were able to accomplish. I was privileged that I was the only landlord in the state of Oregon that she actually came to. That makes it a lot easier to negotiate when it's just one person sitting over the table with the other. So we came to Senate Bill 608. We came to the agreement ultimately at the end. She didn't get everything she asked for, I didn't get everything I asked for, but we both felt like this was a good landing spot, a good place to give it a try. It's going to do real good, but we also knew it was going to take time to collect the data to see if it was doing the good that it was intended to do. So we reached that conclusion and we drafted the bill. I was intimately involved in the drafting of the 28 pages of it. She wanted to make sure that we captured the intent of our conversations, which I greatly appreciated. We also agreed that there wasn't going to be amendments to the bill, for the most part, without either her or I's approval of it, joint approval. That would help it get passed quickly, and that would allow her to go on to bigger and greater things in the legislature, which she was able to accomplish. So that's kind of the backstory that hasn't been told. I've done lots of interviews. Once the session was in process, everybody was looking at Oregon as an example with Senate Bill 608, so Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times. But I haven't told that story until now. I didn't feel like I could without the speaker's approval. So with her approval this morning, I was able to convey a bit of the backstory as how we came to land on Senate Bill 608. She was intimately involved, and she's an incredible negotiator. So yeah, that's the backstory.
It sounds like she was taking pointers from the bicameral bipartisan work of the Coastal Caucus and how to move things forward here for the coastal communities. Jim, thank you so much for that backstory and the history on where we are with 608 today. And so I'm going to skip question 4 because I think we kind of covered a lot of that and move right into question 5, and which would be to John but all. What would you say to people considering advancing additional tenant protection bills in the future? Or is this enough for now and why?
So, couple thoughts. I think one of the benefits of 608 that people aren't focusing on, as a sort of hinted at it, is that we're nationally, with Matthew Desmond, recognizing that there's a correlation between evictions and homelessness. So I'm thinking that there won't be any change with regard to the good cause termination provisions. There will be pressure from tenant groups, especially in the Portland area, to lower the rent cap. My own reading of the tea leaves is it's not going to happen. I don't think there's the stomach in the legislature to change that. Marissa talked about it earlier, waiting to see how this plays out. How does it work or does it work? It's too soon to say that it works or doesn't work. Representative Brock Smith is concerned that it's bad. Let's see if it's bad. Let's see how good it is. I think that the rent cap is significant in terms of taking away the rent gouging. But I also don't want to discourage new development. So, we were talking about threading the needle earlier. I don't know whether we thread the needle, whether Jim and Tina threaded the needle, but that's the hope. There are other tenant protection issues. There were a couple of other bills in the session that passed. 608 wasn't the only one. There were smaller things. Senator Brzezinski, for example, had a bill that says that landlords can no longer deny applicants because of a conviction for marijuana possession or use. It's no longer illegal. So you shouldn't be screening somebody who was convicted for that. I think a lot of people didn't pay attention to that, but it passed. There was another bill Senator Kelser had with regard to screening fees, application fees. And then Senator Fagan had a bill about expungement of FEPs. So I'm not sure how well either of those last two work. Those are also bills that we need to see whether they work. This is what I do for a living, is try to figure out the landlord tenant laws. I'm not sure how they work. We may see others. Portland is the petri dish of experiments on landlord tenant regulation these days. And Jill has to pay attention to that. I don't. My co-workers at Oregon Law Center do, but they are looking at some pretty comprehensive, I don't know what to say, overbearing regulation of screening criteria and deposits. Both of those are issues that create a lot of anxiety among tenants. The Oregon Landlord Tenant Act was adopted in 1973, and the biggest complaint of tenants, security deposits. It's still the biggest complaint of tenants, security deposits, and a feeling that landlords don't return them or withhold them unfairly. Is there a way to regulate it? I don't know. Portland's trying. But I don't think we're going to see, I'm begging legislators not to do anything in 2020. I hope we don't see anything about 608 in 2021. I think we need to take time to do that. And I also don't think there's a stomach with the legislature to do. There are some issues about manufactured housing parks, and we're not really talking about that much today. Those tenancies were included in 608. A lot of those tenants are seniors, and a 10% rent increase is a huge blow to them, and they can't move. I mean, you can say to apartment tenants, if you don't like it, move somewhere else. And we're trying to encourage supply. There is no growth in supply of manufactured housing park tenancies, and they can't move because it costs $20,000 to move their manufactured home. So it's a different dynamic. I work in it a lot these days. I don't know whether there's a solution.
So I'll jump in real quick just to say I agree with John that there shouldn't be any major changes, hopefully, to Senate Bill 608 or the rent cap in the near future. As you alluded to earlier, point-in-time studies are flawed and don't accurately represent the broader spectrum of data. We need to give this time. This was first in the nation rent stabilization. So it's a huge step, maybe in the right direction, but I think the worst thing we can do is start tweaking it before we understand where we landed in the data that's coming in. Give it time. If it's either going to all go really well, or it's all really not going to go well. Until we give time for the data to come in, we don't know if we're hurting or helping.
Thank you. Director Rue, we're going to you. We're going to talk about land use, which is one, of course, the issues that we have in the state with accessibility to land and build housing. And how do cities and counties fit in the recently adopted state legislation on rent and housing development? And how will the urban growth boundaries be affected?
So first of all, excuse me, Jim Rue, hay fever, throat, so forgive me for that. This is sometimes a lifeline, but in Oregon, all planning is local. So the specific answer to your question is that House Bill 2001 and 2003 are going to have really an extraordinary impact on local government. In the bill, in 2001, we got $3.5 million that will go directly to local governments to help them do the planning. House Bill 2001 applies to every city in the state of 10,000 people and more. Out of the 241 cities in the state, 57 of them, I think, are of a population of 10,000 or more. There are different requirements depending upon the size of the city. Those cities of 10 to 25,000 have fewer planning tasks than those of 25,000 and above. And we can perhaps get into some of the details of that a little bit. But the specific answer to your question, Representative, is that it's going to be a huge workload for local government, hence the $3.5 million. Most of that money is going to go to smaller cities because, frankly, they have less capacity than the larger cities. And that money will be divided, some in direct service grants, some hiring consultants to do some of the work for communities. The second big task is that DLCD, our department, has begun the process already of drafting a model rule. Because the specific issue here, this is controversial. The specific issue is that 2001, the so-called Middle Housing Bill, removes the zoning restrictions on single-family zones. It does not mandate that there be multi-family housing built in single-family zones, but it does mandate that communities plan for it. And so it's controversial in its language, in its effect. And so we are already beginning the process of outreach to local governments. We're going to do 4 listening sessions around the state. We're working on this model code. That model code will be done by legislation. It needs to be done by the end of 20. We're targeting actually July 1 of 20, finish it 6 months early, so that local government has more opportunity to either adopt it or adopt one of their own. So the long and the short of it is an enormous amount of work for local governments of communities of 10,000 and more, working with Margaret and with Cameron. We hope that we can ease some of that burden, but it's going to be a big deal.
Yes, I am a land use professor. I gave a fun lecture about the legacy of single-family home zoning in front of the state legislature when they were considering 2001. But first I want to apologize to Cameron. I forgot that you were also a director because we didn't know each other. But you can also help me get my data if you would like. There's like 3 of you here. So for me, 2001 I think is incredibly significant. The legacy of single-family home zoning, most of us don't know how steeped in racism and classism the emergence of the single-family home zone is. I know it's really hard. How many of y'all grew up in single-family homes? Most of us. And so it's really hard to hear that we are living in a system that was designed to exclude. And that's what zoning is. It's exclusion of uses unless they're directly permitted. We're the first in the state to do this. It's a huge deal. And it does, to me, I think, take the first and probably most aggressive step, and I'll be interested to hear if Jim Rue agrees, to actually living up to Goal 10 of the state land use code. Goal 10, I pulled it up because I love this goal. At PSU, we're required to have favorite goals. My favorite one is actually number 1, community engagement, but I also love number 10. So the beginning of Goal 10 is to provide for the housing needs of citizens, community members of the state. Buildable lands for residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needing housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households, and allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. In a lot of our areas, oh, Jim's already taking the mic. In a lot of our areas, well, actually all of our areas, the greatest land use we have in our cities is in fact single-family home residential areas exclusively. It's an inordinately inefficient use of land, and again, it's been predicated on these ideas that if you can't afford a single-family home, you don't deserve to be here. And oftentimes the extreme solution, we've ended up in this environment where it's single-family home or really intense apartments, multifamily only. And again, that was deliberately created in the early 1900s. There's nothing natural about going from a single-family home to like a 10-story apartment building. There are all different types of housing options in that range. I know that a lot of people get really concerned because suddenly when we evaluate urban growth boundaries, we're going to be having a much higher density level threshold, but not every parcel will be able to be built at the highest number of units that the state policy asks for, right? So there'll be engineering issues. The odds that an alien is coming tomorrow to buy every piece of property in your city and overnight build the highest density use possible on that property is pretty low. So these things, again, will happen over time. And if we do see unintended consequences, like significant conversion from single-family home lots to really intense uses that start to threaten traffic and infrastructure issues, then that's when we try to revisit. But I do see this as a significant point for trying to move forward. I do think it is really important in this. We're going to talk about affordable housing very specifically in a little while. Housing type choice is not the same thing as providing affordable housing. And so I'm going to repeat that because these things get conflated a lot. You can have a lot of housing choices and type choices, and they will be at different price levels. Some of those price levels will be lower than the other because the units are smaller or they're attached to another unit. But that does not necessarily mean that they will be affordable. I was able to buy my home in St. John's in Portland, not close in, it's just in the city, but still in Portland. I was only able to buy in that neighborhood because there were skinny houses. I am a tenured professor. I am above 100% of median household income. That house let me stay in the neighborhood, but it is not helping most of the people be able to stay in that neighborhood.
And I don't think Marissa would be surprised by this, but I agree with her almost entirely. When Goal 10 was written in 1973, 46 years ago, there were no real rules attached to it. And so it was aspirational in language. And frankly, I think that this is probably our first real opportunity to begin to realize what Goal 10 aspired to 46 years ago. And just very quickly, in practice, Goal 10 and the land use system require that every community in the state has a comprehensive plan for their growth. Most of those plans have not been touched in 46 years because many communities are not growing. Those that are need to provide for a 20-year supply of every type of housing that the community expects to see. And to Marissa's point, we've never had enforcement to be able to deal with that because of tax compression. The first developers coming into the building permit office offering to build mega mansions where the tax bill to the city is going to be greater are usually the ones that get the permits. And so to Marissa's point, this really is the first opportunity where we have a chance to hold communities to the language of the goal that says you have to provide housing affordability for everybody in your community.
So I'm a land use policy volunteer, or at least I was, for 24 years. I was on the City of Eugene Planning Commission for 12 years, and then I was on the Land Conservation and Development Commission for 12 years, the commission that hires and fires Jim, although I did not hire and fire Jim. But I was the chair for the last 7 years of LCDC. There's a famous saying about Oregonians' view of land use. There are two things they hate: sprawl and density. And most of them don't understand that those are inconsistent. I can't tell you the number of times as a planning commissioner I had people come in before the planning commission and say, please don't build or allow building on the lot next to mine. There are deer there. And you just want to scream and say, ma'am, there were deer on your lot before your house was built. They don't quite get it. But remember the three-pronged approach I mentioned earlier that this legislature took. One of those prongs was to allow, not make, but allow the private sector to build more housing and more cheaply. Probably for decades, the private sector builders, the home builders, the realtors, the bankers have been saying that cities are too restrictive in what they allow or don't allow. In my view, most cities don't do that deliberately. They don't really have the staff or the time or the capacity to figure out how to simplify their codes. That's one of the things that we're trying to make happen going forward. But some cities don't want to allow more housing. Just as with the single family zone, some cities don't want to allow those people to do that. And there's a ton of pushback from cities about 2001 because the state is making them do something. And nobody likes to be made to do anything. Well, guess what? Senate Bill 100, the land use bill was. It was a groundbreaking law making cities and counties do or not do something. This is not really different. An example of what the state land use program does to cities is, for example, to say you can't prohibit manufactured home parks in your communities because there were cities such as Crestwell, a big city, that didn't want manufactured housing parks in their communities. So this law came about because cities weren't doing enough to make development easier. It won't be easy for them to do it, but the law is going to make them do it.
So I'm going to go off script here for a minute. Rosie's probably freaking out there. But with regards to the resources for assistance in planning, Director Rue, are there resources for our smaller communities, especially those on the coast, that are under 10,000, that still need to move forward? Because we've talked about the communities that are over 10,000, but what about those that are under 10,000?
So the answer is yeah, sorta. So 2001 and 2003 applied specifically to communities of 10,000 and above. On the coast, there are only two of those, Coos Bay and Newport. But the ability to do a housing needs analysis, which is this survey of the community, what does your population look like, what is your housing stock, how are you meeting the needs of the population? What is your so-called buildable land inventory? What space do you have to build? And then how much do you need to add to get to where you need to be? The housing needs analysis work started with money that we got mostly at the speaker again, at her initiative. We spent $1.7 million, roughly 35 to 50,000 per city just in this last year. So we were able to do somewhere in the range of 40 or 50 cities to get their housing needs analyses up to date. There's still a ton of work to do, and at this point we don't have the money to do it because we're diverting so much of our resources to the 10,000 and above. So you can bet that we're going to be back with our budget request for the 21-23 session to start talking about the needs in smaller communities, because particularly in rural communities, the housing stock is old, it's inadequate, it has not been renovated, lousy plumbing, lousy electrical, no insulation. Much of the housing for the lower end of the affordability scale is just utterly inadequate, and we need to start helping communities address that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cameron Smith, the Director of the Department of Consumer and Business Services, and I'm questioning Representative Brock Smith's and Rosie's judgment that you all want to hear about the technical details of the statewide building code after these long 7 panels. It is one portion of what DCDS does in terms of our consumer protection, our insurance regulation, our financial regulation. But I want to sum up what I think I've heard here today, not just on this important housing discussion, but all of the other panels. We're talking about how do you set statewide policy that sets that left and right lateral limit and the outcomes that we all want to achieve across these different areas, but that also honors the uniqueness and the flexibility and the innovation, whether it's at a regional level or a local community level. We know from all the panelists and the different discussions, what works on the coast doesn't work in Portland Metro, or the differences across our state, or even just up and down the coast. What works in Brookings won't work in Astoria or Newport or anywhere in between, or just that they're different. And I think out of the range of issues that passed this session across such a huge swath, it's not just how you set that policy, but now how do we turn to implementation and actually make it work. And it's going to have a huge local component. So that kind of build, don't build land use decision turns in then the next level at that local decision making across cities and counties. How do you do conversions of single family homes into multifamily? What does it look like for new construction, whether on infill or existing expansions? And I would also just touch kind of a broader infrastructure play when we hear about the tsunami threat, when we hear about wildfire threats, whether in coastal communities or across the state. Again, how do we use the strengths of the statewide building code that creates uniformity and consistency, whether for consumer protections and safety, or great for developers, contractors, and the trades for that certainty, but also honor that local innovation and flexibility. So we'll keep using tools that then local communities can adopt as an appendix on tsunami standards for critical infrastructure, and then also hardening residential homes on the wildfire threat. Again, on that voluntary and local community decision-making process, but with that clear guidance as things change, setting those statewide policies.
Great, and we're getting close to the end of time, but I wanted to at least get one more question around the group and modify it a little bit. Because with the population growth that we're going to see, and of course we gain about 1 million people every 20 years or so. And with that growth, and it's going to increase due to other circumstances and the benefits of the Pacific Northwest has to offer in Oregon, what can we do? Because we've already discussed that we have a housing shortfall of about over 120,000 units. And so we all, I think, can agree that supply is an issue. So what can we do as a state, local governments? I know that some of my communities have waived SDC, system development charges, to encourage new housing developments within their community. So what can we do as a state and local government? Because we have many commissioners here. As we move forward to incentivize those builders to provide not only for the shortage of 120,000 units, but the increased units that are going to be necessary for the population growth within the state in the future years.
So, moment, right? So I spoke earlier about the kind of the bread and butter affordable housing programs that we'll be administering. I think we need to continue with that level of investment. But as we look forward, I completely agree with the statements around getting the private sector housing supply engine moving. And there are many communities around the state that have not seen any housing development to speak of at any income level, at any price point, at any housing type over the last 10, 15 years. So we need to do something to break into that. So a couple of things that we're looking at, specifically around rural communities and the coast. In our statewide housing plan, our 5-year strategic plan, we have a specific policy priority around small towns and rural communities. And we have made a commitment to change the way that we do business in small towns and rural communities and to dramatically increase the number of homes that we are helping to facilitate in those communities, because we understand that there are structural differences, gaps in financing that just make this kind of housing very difficult to pencil out, whether it's affordable housing or market rate housing. So a couple of things that we're focusing on, trying to lean into, we've been talking closely with our friends at DLCD around how do we have joint approaches to technical assistance for local governments so that we can help folks to be able to look at things, whether it's SDC waivers, whether it's kind of tax waivers, other kinds of policies, best practices that can be replicated around the state to learn from those kinds of approaches, identify buildable lands, make those opportunities available, and then provide kind of incentives for local builders and developers. So there's one program that we've been working on, which is the Governor's Workforce Housing Program, which is a pilot to really look at how we can get private developers, local governments, and employers to work together around the table to come up with some development concepts for the kind of missing middle housing price point for Oregon's workforce, particularly in small communities. The governor has heard loud and clear from employers that part of what's limiting their ability to grow and to retain the workforce is the lack of available and attainable housing. So we have a number of pilots running around the state right now. We have 5 of them. 2 of them are here on the coast. One of them is in Lincoln County around a community land trust model, and one of them is with Mesteca Ridge Development further north to really look at providing that sort of privately funded housing stock for that missing middle workforce band with just a very small investment from the state to help fill in the gaps. So we got some resources from the legislative session to expand that work, but those are the kinds of models we need to start testing and to be able to replicate, because it may turn out that that sort of technical assistance coupled with the regulatory reforms and land use that we're talking about, that can really help open up the expansion of housing.
So besides what Margaret just talked about, we mentioned a couple of those things already. Money is an issue. Affordable housing costs money. You can't just build it cheaply because the rents are not going to cover more than the operating expenses. So one of the things local governments can do is to provide money. Well, most local governments don't have money, but the legislature has authorized them to adopt a construction excess tax. The legislature used to prohibit it. There was a preemption on that. 2 years ago, the legislature authorized that. It's not just a big city thing. Newport has adopted a construction excess tax. Corvallis has adopted one. Medford has adopted one. Hood River has adopted one. Tillamook adopted one, and the local realtors referred it to the people, and it got repealed. But it's possible to do it, and that is very flexible money that the city can use to build housing. There are other tools as well. There are property tax exemptions which cities can adopt that will minimize the operating expense of affordable housing projects. I have a list of all those exemptions and how you can adopt them. If you email me some materials, I'll be glad to send that to you. I also have a memo that outlines the requirements for a construction excise tax, who has one, blah, blah, blah. Email me and I'll give you that memo as well. But there are smaller things too. One of the bills that passed was House Bill 2916, thanks to Representative Marsh. 2916 amends an existing statute that has a fun backstory that's too long, but it involves former Coos County Senator Earl Tarnow, one of the all-time great legislative names. That statute authorizes urban campgrounds, calling them transitional housing, but it allows cities to allow an urban campground. Even though most of our land use laws prohibit that sort of thing, and even though these campgrounds provide tents or huts or Conestoga wagons that are not habitable because they don't have bathrooms, they don't have running water, they don't have heat, they violate landlord-tenant law. But under this statute, it doesn't matter. Cities can do this now. Dan Bryant, a minister in Eugene, has been the Johnny Appleseed of these campgrounds going around the state. There is one now in Florence. Greg, where are you?
That's not true.
Not true, it's not, you're not an urban campground?
No.
You got RVs?
Yes.
Okay. So Dan Bryant visited Florence, met Greg, done some stuff here. There are other places that have these. Medford has one. Clackamas County has one. Medford has two. Clackamas County has them. So a lot of legislators reacted badly to that because they don't like the idea of saying that it's okay for people to live in tents or huts, but it's a lot better than living on the street.
Is there anyone else that wants to talk about the future and what incentives that we can offer for?
I would just add one other, I love solutions that cross into different areas, and as we heard out of all the K through 12, how do we further develop to have a thriving construction industry? How do we continue to further push the CTE and the STEM and the workforce development on the professional building trade, make sure that we have enough folks to build these and also inspect them on the government side. And demographically, John had mentioned it briefly, but seniors and that aging boom that we'll continue to see, I think it's going to be a very different housing conversation. What has gotten us services and ability to support Oregon seniors for the last 30 years, I think will look very differently going forward for the next 30. I think that's going to be a unique scenario.
Let me jump in really quick. So as a third generation builder and developer, my family is overseeing the construction of thousands of homes in Oregon. Just a year and a half ago, I did a simple experiment as we were having issues with the housing crisis. I figured with my background, my family's background, and my contacts in the construction industry, figured, well, heck, let me see what all the fuss is about. So I built a duplex on an infill lot. I already owned it. And the interesting thing is since I was doing it as an experiment, I tracked every penny. Over 23% of the cost of building that infill house, and it was a duplex and I was trying to build affordable housing, over 23% was additional fees. So it wasn't all the system development fees, but it was additional costs that were put upon me in order to build that. I simply could not meet the rent that I was hoping to obtain when you factored in the cost for that. That's important. Getting rid of system development fees is that's a great incentive, but there needs to be collaboration with the cities. They need money as well. They need money for their infrastructure to either provide them with that money as an incentive, not just taking away from money, but making sure that they don't just kind of play whack-a-mole and slide the cost over to a different area that gets passed on to the developers. We want to build housing. It's just oddly expensive right now to do so. And I know that it's not all the city or the county's fault, but that could certainly help when over 23-25% of the cost is in getting those permits and fees and additional infrastructure costs.
So first I just want to remind everyone that my name is Marisa or Marisa. You can't roll the R, Marisa is just fine, but there's only one S in my name. That's a very common mistake, but just FYI. I think I moved here from the city of Cincinnati, and that is a city in serious decline, incredibly high poverty rates, and absolutely nobody wanting to build anything in the city. And so they were giving everything away that they could. Urban planning came out of a time of growth and the desire for people to build. We're not as good at actually knowing what to do when people don't want to build something. And so the first instinct is to give things away. And I think that there are cases in which that makes a lot of sense. The city of Portland's SDCs, I was stunned when I found out what they were. And so, so I think really thinking about what are necessary funds and costs, but to also keep in mind that if you are successful at inducing development, to really think about the possible issues related to displacement. And we're also really bad about doing that for reasons that make sense. When no one wants to build, your tax base is flat, you want people to come in. And when they start coming in, the chances that you're gonna have people be displaced is quite high. Urban planners will try to say that's an unintended consequence. That is an entirely predictable consequence. And so we want to make sure that we're setting up things to keep the people that we're trying to help living in the city. I also just want to disagree with something that Jim Straub had said earlier, which was that for a long time all of these systems worked really well. They've actually never worked well for people of color in the state of Oregon or in the country. And so when we start thinking about how we might get people to build in our places, we need to be thinking about displacement across all class positions, but also really thinking about the legacies of communities of color.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you for joining our discussion and my panelists. Please give them a round of applause.